The question of whether the Bible is a historical document or fiction has been debated for centuries. But the way we approach this question today is far different from how people in the past did. For a long time, the Bible was treated as if it were the unquestionable record of human history. Kings, priests, and common people alike were told that the stories within its pages were literal accounts of events that truly happened. But when we actually place the Bible side by side with what archaeology, history, and textual analysis have uncovered, the image becomes much more complicated. In fact, the more evidence we gather, the more the Bible looks like a blend of myth, political propaganda, cultural memory, and moral storytelling, rather than a consistent historical record. Take the earliest parts of the Bible, for instance. The book of Genesis tells the story of creation, the flood, and the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For thousands of years, people believed these were straightforward historical accounts. But modern science has shown us that the Earth is billions of years old, not a few thousand. Geological studies prove there was never a global flood that covered all the mountains. Genetics and anthropology make it clear that humanity did not descend from just two people in a garden. Already, the opening chapters of the Bible collapse under the weight of evidence. That alone should raise questions. If the foundation is myth, how much of the rest is reliable? Some argue that while the opening stories are symbolic, later sections, like the accounts of the Exodus or the kingdoms of Israel, are historically grounded. Yet this claim also falls apart when we check it against the evidence. The book of Exodus describes a massive group of Hebrew slaves escaping Egypt, wandering the desert for 40 years, and eventually conquering Canaan. But there is no archaeological evidence of this. Egypt, one of the most bureaucratic and record-keeping societies in history, has left us extensive documents, temple inscriptions, and lists of events. They recorded grain harvests, military campaigns, and tax receipts. Yet there is not a single mention of an entire enslaved people escaping, let alone plagues and disasters that supposedly devastated the land. Archaeologists who have studied the Sinai Desert have found no traces of millions of people wandering there, no campsites, no tools, no bones. The story seems more like a national myth created to give the Israelites an identity, not a piece of historical reporting. The conquest of Canaan, as described in the book of Joshua, also crumbles under scrutiny. According to the text, the Israelites destroyed cities like Jericho in violent battles, bringing down walls and wiping out populations. But archaeologists have thoroughly excavated Jericho, and the results are clear. At the supposed time of Joshua, there were no walls to come crashing down. The city was either uninhabited or far smaller than the Bible describes. The same goes for other towns supposedly destroyed in the conquest. Evidence shows that many of them were not occupied at all during that period. Instead of a sweeping military campaign, the actual settlement of Canaan looks more like a gradual cultural shift and blending of peoples, with no evidence for the kind of miraculous victories the Bible describes. Then there's the question of the united monarchy under David and Solomon. The Bible paints a picture of a glorious empire, with Jerusalem as a wealthy capital, grand temples, and international power. But archaeology once again tells a different story. Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE, the supposed time of David and Solomon, was a small hill town, not the mighty capital of a sprawling empire. Excavations reveal no evidence of the vast wealth or monumental buildings described in the Bible. The famous Temple of Solomon, said to have been a grand structure covered in gold, leaves no archaeological trace. Many historians now believe that the stories of David and Solomon were exaggerated, or even invented centuries later, to give legitimacy to later kings, particularly during the time when the Hebrew people were rebuilding their identity after exile. It was less about recording history and more about constructing a past that could unite and inspire. The same pattern repeats in the later historical books. Stories are written with clear political motives. When a king is favored by the priests, his reign is described as righteous and blessed by God. When a king resists priestly power or introduces foreign influences, he is written into history as wicked. This is not objective reporting. It's selective propaganda. The Bible is filled with these editorial judgments, shaping the narrative not to record events neutrally, but to push theological and political agendas. Just like later rulers throughout history rewrote or reshaped history to legitimize themselves, the authors of the Bible did the same. Some people try to salvage the Bible's credibility by saying that even if the miraculous elements are untrue, the core events are still reliable. But this is not how reliable history works. If a text consistently blends myth with fact, miracle with mundane, and propaganda with memory, how do we separate one from the other? And more importantly, why trust it at all as a reliable source when we have more direct forms of evidence? Archaeological remains, inscriptions, independent historical records that can give us a clearer picture. Take the Assyrian and Babylonian empires as an example. When we study them, we don't rely on mythic stories written hundreds of years later. We have cuneiform tablets, detailed administrative records, chronicles carved into stone, and monumental architecture that can be dated with precision. These sources allow historians to reconstruct events with accuracy. By comparison, the Bible is vague, contradictory, and written long after the supposed events it describes. It often serves more as theological storytelling than as a diary of real events. If we applied the same standards of evidence to the Bible as we do to any other historical text, its credibility would collapse. Another problem is that the Bible is not one book, but a collection of writings compiled over centuries. It was written by many different authors with competing views, edited and re-edited in shifting political contexts. This patchwork nature makes it highly unreliable as a historical record. Even within the text, there are glaring contradictions about the same events. Two different books will give different numbers of soldiers, different lengths of reigns, or entirely different accounts of the same battle. These inconsistencies are what you expect from oral traditions and later editing, not from accurate historical documentation. The more you examine the text, the clearer it becomes that the authors were not primarily concerned with factual reporting. Their goal was to weave stories that carried moral, theological, or national significance. The New Testament faces similar problems. The Gospels are often treated as eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, but they were written decades after his death by unknown authors. None of them claim to be written by people who directly knew him. By the time the Gospels were composed, the communities who wrote them had already developed theological interpretations of Jesus, and those interpretations shaped the narratives. This is why the Gospels contradict each other on basic facts. Who was at the tomb, what Jesus said on the cross, or even the order of key events. These are not the signs of objective history, but of storytelling shaped by faith communities. Even more telling is that outside of the Gospels, independent historical sources from the same time are either silent about Jesus or provide only brief, uncertain references written decades later. If Jesus truly performed the world-shaking miracles described in the Bible, healing the sick, raising the dead, turning water into wine, why do contemporary Roman records, Jewish writings, and historians like Philo say nothing about him? The silence is deafening. Some apologists argue that the survival of the Bible itself is proof of its truth, but survival does not equal accuracy. Many myths survive. The Homeric epics survived, but we don't treat the tales of Zeus and Athena as literal history. The stories of Gilgamesh, written long before the Bible, also survived. Yet no one argues that they are historical documents. What makes the Bible different is not its truth, but the power structures that enforced its use. Governments, empires, and churches invested enormous resources in copying, distributing and enforcing the authority of the Bible. Its survival was the product of human power, not divine truth. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, the Bible resembles other mythic traditions more than it does historical chronicles. The flood story in Genesis echoes earlier Mesopotamian myths, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, which also describes a man who survives a global flood by building a boat. The birth story of Moses, set adrift in a basket on the Nile, closely mirrors older Mesopotamian legends. The story of Jesus shares motifs with earlier dying and rising gods from surrounding cultures. In every case, what we see is not unique history, but the recycling and reworking of older mythic patterns to serve new purposes. Even the way the Bible was canonized exposes its non-historical nature. The collection of books that became the Bible was not chosen because they were the most reliable historical accounts. They were chosen by councils and authorities who had theological and political motives. Many writings were excluded, not because they were less historical, but because they didn't fit the desired narrative. What we have today is the result of centuries of selection, editing, and suppression, not a straightforward record of human history. It is a curated anthology designed to produce faith and obedience, not to report facts. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that the Bible is more fiction than history comes from how its authors wrote about the past. They were not historians in the modern sense. Ancient writers often blended history with legend, myth, and moral lessons. Their aim was not to separate fact from fiction, but to convey meaning, identity, and power. In the case of the Bible, this blending is obvious. Kings are judged not by how they ruled, but by whether they followed religious law. Battles are described not with careful detail, but with supernatural interventions. Armies routed by divine plagues, or cities collapsing from trumpet blasts. Real history is messy and filled with uncertainty. The Bible, by contrast, presents simplified morality tales, where victory comes not from strategy, but from obedience, and failure comes not from political mistakes, but from disobedience to God. That narrative style alone should alert us that we are dealing with literature designed to teach and control, not neutral records of events. Even when biblical stories align with known historical events, the way they are told reveals more about theology than about reality. For example, the Babylonian exile is a well-documented historical event. We know from Babylonian records that many elites from Judah were taken to Babylon after the conquest. But the Bible frames this event not as a product of imperial politics and military conquest, but as divine punishment for the sins of the people. The same pattern occurs with the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome centuries later. Instead of recognizing the political rebellion and overwhelming military response that caused the disaster, the Gospels frame it as divine judgment. In both cases, the events are real, but the interpretation is distorted to fit a theological message. This distortion makes the Bible unreliable as history, because it prioritizes moral lessons over accurate reporting. Another revealing factor is how the Bible uses numbers. Historians know that ancient authors often exaggerated numbers to make events seem more impressive. In the Bible, armies are described as numbering in the hundreds of thousands, or even millions, figures that would have been impossible given the population size of the region. The wilderness wanderings, for example, are said to involve over 600,000 men, not including women and children, which would mean a total population of more than 2 million people. Yet the land of Egypt at that time likely had a population of only a few million in total. Such numbers are logistically absurd. They reflect a desire to glorify the story, not to report it accurately. Historians who study the region agree that the figures in the Bible cannot be taken literally. They are closer to epic storytelling than to census records. There's also the issue of anachronisms, details in the Bible that do not fit the time they are supposed to describe. For instance, in the story of the patriarchs, camels are frequently mentioned as beasts of burden. But archaeological evidence shows that camels were not domesticated in the region until many centuries later. This means that the stories were written or edited much later than the time they claim to describe, with the authors projecting their own contemporary world back into the past. Similar anachronisms appear throughout the text, whether in the mention of certain cities, cultural practices, or technologies that did not exist at the time of the supposed events. These errors further undermine the claim that the Bible is historical. Another way to test the Bible's reliability is by comparing it to external records. When we do this, the Bible fails consistently. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and Romans kept detailed records of their empires, including lists of kings, military campaigns, and conquered territories. These records often contradict the biblical narrative. For example, the Bible describes Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, as being defeated by divine intervention when his army besieged Jerusalem. Yet Assyrian records tell a different story. Sennacherib boasts of trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Archaeology confirms that many towns in Judah were destroyed by the Assyrians, but Jerusalem survived because Hezekiah paid tribute, not because of a miraculous plague. The Bible transforms a humiliating act of submission into a story of divine victory. Once again, it is propaganda, not history. Even in the New Testament, where the stakes are highest for believers, the same pattern holds. The Gospels differ not only in details, but also in their theological emphasis. Matthew emphasizes Jesus as the new Moses, constantly linking him to Old Testament prophecies. Luke portrays Jesus as a universal savior concerned with the poor and marginalized. John presents a mystical figure who speaks in long theological discourses that sound nothing like the parables in the earlier Gospels. These are not historical portraits. They are theological constructs tailored to different communities. If 4 different authors, writing decades later, can produce 4 contradictory portraits of the same figure, what does that say about the reliability of the material? It tells us we are dealing with storytelling shaped by faith, not by eyewitness testimony. The resurrection, the central claim of Christianity, also reveals the Bible's fictional tendencies. The accounts differ on who went to the tomb, what they saw, and what Jesus said afterward. Some Gospels say the women found an angel. Others say they found 2. One says Jesus appeared first in Galilee, another in Jerusalem. The contradictions are not minor. They strike at the core of the story. If this event were truly the most important moment in history, you would expect consistent testimony. Instead, we see the kind of legendary development that happens when stories are passed along orally and adapted for different audiences. The resurrection looks less like history and more like myth-making. It's also telling to consider what the Bible leaves out. Major world events that should have had a profound impact on the people of Israel are often ignored or misrepresented. The rise and fall of empires, the movements of large populations, and the cultural shifts in the region are barely mentioned unless they can be framed as part of God's plan. By contrast, historical sources from neighboring cultures give us detailed accounts of trade, law, architecture, and daily life. The Bible's silence on these matters suggests that it was not meant to be a record of history at all. Its focus was narrow, reinforcing identity, promoting obedience, and legitimizing authority. The way the Bible has been transmitted also undermines its credibility. We do not have the original manuscripts of any biblical book. What we have are copies of copies, written centuries later, with thousands of variations between them. Scholars who study textual criticism have documented how scribes added, removed, or altered passages over time. Some changes were accidental, but many were deliberate, inserted to clarify doctrine or to support theological arguments. The famous story of the woman caught in adultery, where Jesus says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," is absent from the earliest manuscripts. The longer ending of Mark, where Jesus appears after the resurrection, is also a later addition. These examples show that the text we have today is not fixed history, but a living, edited document shaped by human hands. One of the most striking examples of the Bible's unreliability comes from prophecy. Believers often point to supposed fulfilled prophecies as proof of divine inspiration. But when you look closely, many of these so-called prophecies were written after the events they describe. Scholars call this vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy after the fact. For example, the book of Daniel describes detailed events from the Hellenistic period, but it was actually written during that time, presenting recent history as if it were prophecy. This literary device gave the impression of divine foreknowledge, but in reality, it was a way to encourage people living under oppression. Far from being evidence of divine truth, it shows how the authors used literary tricks to give their writings authority. Another important aspect to consider is how the Bible was used by those in power. Throughout history, rulers and religious leaders have leaned on the Bible not because it was historically accurate, but because it gave them legitimacy. The text was invoked to justify wars, to enforce obedience, and to demand loyalty. In medieval Europe, kings ruled by divine right because they could point to biblical precedent. In the United States, slaveholders quoted the Bible to defend slavery. In every case, the authority of the text mattered more than its historical truth. That tells us something important. The Bible's power has never come from its accuracy, but from the willingness of people to believe it. Fiction can be just as powerful as fact when people treat it as truth. When we step back and analyze the Bible as literature, it becomes easier to see its real nature. It is a collection of myths, legends, and cultural memories stitched together, edited, and reinterpreted over time. Some parts may contain echoes of real events, but those echoes are distorted by layers of storytelling. Just as the stories of King Arthur or the Trojan War may have kernels of truth buried beneath legend, so too might some biblical stories. But just as we do not treat the tales of Arthur's Round Table or Achilles' battles as reliable history, we should not treat the Bible as such either. The difference is that the Bible has been granted a sacred status that discourages critical examination. Yet once we apply the same standards of evidence that we use for other ancient texts, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The Bible is not a historical document in any reliable sense. The irony is that the Bible itself sometimes hints at its fictional nature. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the writer laments the endless cycles of life and the futility of human endeavors, sounding more like a philosopher than a historian. In the parables of Jesus, we see clear examples of made-up stories designed to illustrate moral lessons, not record facts. If parables can teach without being true, why not the larger narratives as well? The boundary between story and reality was never as firm for ancient authors as it is for us today. Recognizing this helps us understand why the Bible reads the way it does. It was never meant to be history in the modern sense, but rather a collection of stories designed to shape a people, instill values, and maintain power. If the Bible cannot stand as reliable history, why has it been treated as such for so long? The answer lies not in the evidence itself, but in the structures of authority that enforced belief in its accuracy. For most of history, ordinary people did not have access to the tools of critical scholarship, or even to the text itself. The Bible was controlled by priests and rulers who interpreted it for the masses. Questioning its truth was not only discouraged, but often dangerous. Entire societies were built on the assumption that the Bible was factual, and stepping outside that framework could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. It is only in the past few centuries, with the rise of archaeology, comparative history, and critical scholarship, that people have had the freedom and the evidence to test the Bible's claims against reality. Once that testing began, the cracks quickly appeared. One of the most telling discoveries was the finding of older texts that predate and parallel the stories in the Bible. The Epic of Gilgamesh, uncovered in the 19th century, contains a flood narrative strikingly similar to the one in Genesis. In this much older Mesopotamian story, a man is warned by a god to build a boat, save animals, and survive a great flood sent to wipe out humanity. The parallels are undeniable. If the Bible were purely historical, why would its foundational stories so closely resemble myths from neighboring cultures? The simplest explanation is that the biblical authors borrowed and reshaped existing stories, giving them a new theological spin. This pattern repeats throughout the Bible. Older myths are recycled and rebranded as national history. Another example is the law codes. The Code of Hammurabi, written centuries before the laws of Moses, contains many of the same principles. Regulations about property, family life, and justice. The similarities show that the laws in the Bible were not unique revelations, but adaptations of existing legal traditions. They were dressed up in divine language to give them authority, but their roots were firmly human. This doesn't diminish their cultural value, but it does strip away the claim that they were divinely dictated historical truths. The Bible also reflects the biases and limitations of the cultures that produced it. Women are consistently marginalized, treated as property or subordinates. Foreign peoples are often depicted as enemies to be destroyed. Violence is justified when it is commanded by God, but condemned when it is carried out by others. These double standards expose the human hand behind the text. They show us a tribal mentality, not a universal history. When the Israelites succeeded, it was framed as divine favor. When they failed, it was framed as divine punishment. This worldview may have helped ancient people make sense of their lives, but it does not reflect the complexity of actual historical events. When we examine how the Bible was assembled into its current form, its fictional elements become even clearer. The Old Testament was not written all at once, but compiled from multiple sources, often with conflicting perspectives. Scholars have identified at least 4 main strands woven into the Pentateuch, each with its own style and theology. These strands were stitched together into a single narrative, sometimes awkwardly, resulting in contradictions and repetitions. For example, there are 2 different creation accounts in Genesis, back to back, with different orders of events. There are 2 flood narratives interwoven, one where Noah takes 2 of every animal, another where he takes 7 pairs of clean animals. These duplications make sense once you realize that the editors were combining different traditions. But they make no sense if the Bible is supposed to be a straightforward historical record. The New Testament followed a similar path of selection and editing. Many Gospels circulated in the early centuries of Christianity, but only 4 were chosen for the canon. Others, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, were excluded because they did not fit the desired narrative. This process was not about preserving historical accuracy, but about enforcing theological conformity. The texts that survived were those that served the interests of the dominant church. This selective preservation is another sign that the Bible is not a reliable history, but a curated anthology designed to control belief. Archaeology continues to undermine the Bible's historical claims. Excavations in Canaan, for example, show that the Israelites did not arrive as conquerors from outside, but gradually emerged from within the local population. This directly contradicts the conquest narratives in Joshua. The evidence points to a slow cultural evolution, not a dramatic invasion led by divine mandate. Similarly, the absence of evidence for a grand Solomonic empire suggests that the biblical account was inflated to legitimize later rulers. Time and again, the spade in the ground contradicts the words on the page. Even when archaeology confirms that a place existed, it often does so in ways that undercut the biblical narrative. Jericho existed, but not in the way the Bible describes at the time of Joshua. The Philistines existed, but their cultural practices were far more complex than the Bible portrays. The city of Nazareth, said to be Jesus' hometown, shows scant evidence of habitation during the supposed time of his life. These findings don't necessarily prove that everything in the Bible is false, but they consistently show that the details are unreliable, the stories exaggerated, and the timelines distorted. The question then becomes, why continue to treat the Bible as history at all? The answer lies in tradition and authority. For many centuries, the Bible was the only text available to explain the origins of humanity, the history of a people, and the meaning of existence. But with the rise of science and scholarship, we now have better tools. We can study fossils to understand human origins. We can study inscriptions and artifacts to reconstruct the history of nations. We can compare texts across cultures to trace the development of myths. In every case, these tools give us a more accurate picture than the Bible does. Holding on to the Bible as history in the face of this evidence is like insisting that the earth is flat after photographs from space show it is round. It's important to note that treating the Bible as fiction does not mean dismissing it entirely. Fiction can be powerful. Myths shape cultures, inspire art, and guide moral thinking. The Bible has had an enormous influence on literature, philosophy, and politics. But that influence comes from its role as a cultural text, not from its accuracy as history. Recognizing it as fiction actually allows us to appreciate it more honestly. We can study it as we study the Iliad or the Mahabharata, texts filled with mythic grandeur, cultural memory, and human struggle, but not with reliable accounts of what really happened. When people insist that the Bible must be historical to have value, they trap themselves in a false choice. Either it is literal truth or it is worthless. But history shows us that literal truth was never the point. The point was to inspire, to unify, and to control. Once we see that, we can understand both its power and its limitations. The Bible is not a history book. It is a collection of human stories, reflecting the hopes, fears, and ambitions of the people who wrote them. As history, it fails. As a window into the human psyche, it succeeds. This distinction matters because clinging to the Bible as history has real consequences. It distorts education, leading children to learn myths as facts. It fuels political agendas, where laws are justified on the basis of ancient stories rather than reasoned debate. It creates conflict, as different groups interpret the same fictional stories in contradictory ways, and then fight over whose version is true. Treating the Bible as fiction helps diffuse these conflicts by removing the illusion that one group possesses historical certainty. It allows us to move forward with a more honest understanding of both the past and the present. If we are honest, the Bible looks like many other mythological collections from around the world. Its creation stories echo Mesopotamian myths. Its laws reflect earlier codes. Its heroes resemble archetypes found in countless cultures. Its apocalyptic visions share the same patterns as other ancient end-of-the-world tales. The only reason the Bible is treated differently is because it became central to powerful institutions that enforced its authority. Stripped of that enforcement, it is just another anthology of human storytelling, valuable for what it reveals about our ancestors, but not for what it says about history. The deeper we look, the more the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The Bible is not history. It is myth presented as history, fiction dressed up as fact. Its stories may contain fragments of real events, but they are distorted beyond recognition by theology, politics, and imagination. To treat it as reliable history is to ignore the mountains of evidence that say otherwise. To treat it as fiction is to finally see it for what it truly is. A powerful, enduring storybook that has shaped cultures, but not a record of the past. When we strip away the aura of sacredness, the Bible begins to resemble a kind of cultural fossil record. It shows us layer upon layer of human storytelling, preserved over time, shaped by different generations, and reinterpreted as needs changed. The earliest strata are borrowed myths, creation stories, flood narratives, and ancestral legends that mirror those of neighboring peoples. Later layers reveal political agendas, where the stories of kings and wars are rewritten to justify certain rulers, or to warn against rebellion. Still later, layers show theological debates, with competing visions of law, morality, and the nature of God stitched together into a single narrative. In this sense, the Bible is not worthless. It is invaluable, not as history, but as anthropology. It tells us what ancient people feared, what they hoped for, and how they made sense of a chaotic world. This understanding explains why the Bible often reads less like a record of facts and more like a collection of moral theater. Characters are exaggerated to embody virtues or vices. Heroes are impossibly righteous, villains impossibly wicked. Nuance is stripped away in favor of clear moral lessons. David is portrayed as a man after God's own heart, despite his moral failings, because his kingship needed legitimacy. Solomon is depicted as a wise and wealthy ruler, even though archaeology shows no evidence of such grandeur, because later generations wanted to imagine a golden age. In the New Testament, Jesus is depicted differently depending on the needs of each community. For some, he is a teacher of wisdom. For others, a cosmic savior. These are not objective accounts. They are moralized portraits, closer to allegory than to biography. The fictional nature of the Bible becomes even clearer when we compare it to cultures that did produce more reliable histories. The Greeks, for instance, wrote histories that, while imperfect, at least tried to distinguish between myth and fact. Herodotus, often called the father of history, certainly included legends, but he also reported his sources, questioned their reliability, and tried to investigate events critically. Thucydides went further, stripping away divine explanations and focusing on human motives and politics. By contrast, biblical authors showed little interest in questioning or verifying their stories. Events were presented as direct acts of divine will, with little concern for natural explanations or multiple perspectives. The difference is stark. One tradition aimed for truth, however imperfectly, while the other aimed for obedience and faith. This is why modern historians treat the Bible with extreme caution. They use it only as one source among many, and never as a standalone authority. When it aligns with external evidence, it may preserve a kernel of truth. But when it stands alone, unsupported by archaeology or independent records, it is treated as myth. This is the responsible way to handle any ancient text. If we treated the legends of other cultures the way some still treat the Bible, we would believe that Zeus hurled lightning bolts from Olympus, or that the Hindu gods literally fought wars in the skies. Consistency demands that we treat the Bible by the same standards we apply to every other ancient text. When we do, the conclusion is clear. It belongs in the category of myth and fiction. Some might ask, why does it matter? If the Bible is fiction, but still inspires people, why not let it be? The problem is that treating fiction as fact has consequences. Belief in the Bible as literal history has shaped laws, justified violence, and limited knowledge. It has been used to resist science, to oppress minorities, and to control populations. When fiction masquerades as fact, it becomes dangerous. Recognizing the Bible as fiction does not strip it of all value. It liberates us from its authority. It allows us to appreciate it as literature, to study it as cultural history, without being bound by its outdated morals or its false claims. In fact, this shift opens the door to a healthier relationship with the text. Instead of asking, "Did this really happen?" we can ask, "What does this story tell us about the people who wrote it?" Instead of treating it as a divine rulebook, we can study it alongside other mythologies, comparing themes and tracing influences. This approach transforms the Bible from a rigid authority into a fascinating artifact of human creativity. It becomes less a chain that binds thought, and more a window into the minds of those who lived thousands of years ago. There is also a deeper lesson here about the nature of truth. Historical truth is about what actually happened, supported by evidence and reason. Mythical truth is about meaning, morality, and identity, often divorced from fact. The Bible belongs firmly in the second category. It is filled with mythical truths about human longing, about fear of death, about the desire for justice. But these truths are not historical. They are fictional frameworks that helped ancient people navigate their world. Confusing mythical truth with historical truth has been one of the greatest mistakes of human civilization. It has locked generations into dogmas, blinded societies to evidence, and stunted intellectual growth. Learning to distinguish between the two is essential for progress. The most profound irony is that the Bible itself has often been at odds with history. Every time human knowledge has advanced, it has chipped away at biblical claims. Astronomy disproved the geocentric universe implied by Scripture. Geology disproved the global flood. Biology disproved the special creation of humans. Archaeology disproved the conquest of Canaan and the grandeur of Solomon's kingdom. History disproved the idea that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. In every field, the more evidence we uncover, the less reliable the Bible becomes. No genuine discovery has ever confirmed a miraculous biblical claim. The arrow of evidence points consistently in one direction, away from history, toward fiction. And yet, the Bible endures, not because it is history, but because it is story. Humans are storytelling animals. We crave narratives that explain who we are and where we came from. The Bible filled that need for ancient people, and for many, it still does today. But clinging to it as history is like clinging to childhood fairy tales as literal truth. The stories may still move us, but we outgrow the need to mistake them for reality. The real challenge for modern society is whether we can learn to value the Bible as literature without surrendering to its authority as history. To answer the question directly, is the Bible a historical document or fiction? The evidence leaves little doubt. It is not a reliable record of past events. It is a mixture of myth, legend, propaganda, and cultural memory. At best, it contains fragments of historical truth, distorted by centuries of retelling and reshaping. At worst, it is deliberate invention designed to control and inspire. As a historical document, it fails. As fiction, it thrives. It survives not because it tells us what happened, but because it tells us what people wanted to believe happened. This distinction may unsettle those who built their worldview on the Bible's historical claims. But it is also liberating. It frees us to seek truth elsewhere, in evidence, in science, in reason. It allows us to read the Bible without fear, to admire its stories while rejecting its falsehoods. It reminds us that human beings are capable of creating grand narratives without divine intervention. And it challenges us to build new narratives, ones grounded in fact, in compassion, and in a shared pursuit of knowledge. In the end, the Bible belongs not on the shelf of history, but on the shelf of mythology. It sits alongside the epics of Gilgamesh, Homer, and the myths of countless cultures. Its value is not in what it tells us about the past, but in what it reveals about ourselves, our need for meaning, our hunger for belonging, and our capacity to weave fiction so powerful it can shape civilizations. But when we confuse that fiction with fact, we lose sight of reality. The task of our time is to finally make that distinction clear